we now look at James's attitudes to Catholics, he was more lenient and more tolerant, so more likely to be more sympathetic towards Catholics. So, for example, his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was Catholic, and his wife, Anne of Denmark, was a Catholic as well. But he still didn't like a lot of things in the Catholic faith and still wouldn't be like openly sympathetic towards them. I mean, not much. It's like he hated like the Jesuits, for example, which are like the more strict Catholics who are more focused on spreading Catholicism. He was quite hostile towards them, and he was hostile to like the Popish or anybody who was seen to be too openly Catholic. But then he was also the same way to Puritans. So he called a lot of Puritans Puritan Papists, so Puritans who resembled Catholics in a way that they were not liked by James. And so he was ultimately willing to allow Catholics to live their lives, but they had to outwardly conform to the church settlement and to Anglicanism. Just a quick look at the two plots in 1603 that were done by Catholics. So there was the Bye plot in 1603, which was aimed to kidnap James and to force him to announce religious and Catholic tolerance, but it failed, and in response Parliament issued a statute against Catholics which ordered all priests out of England. And then in the same year there was the main plot, which sought to place James's Catholic cousin Arabella Stuart on the throne, but then this failed and those involved were punished harshly, such as Sir Walter Raleigh, who was imprisoned because of this at the Tower of London for 13 years. If we look at how James tried to enforce or be more lenient towards recusancy fines, which are the fines placed against Catholics for not attending Anglican church. And so James was initially quite lenient towards Catholics and ordered the recusancy fines to be reduced, so the start of his reign in 1603. So they fell to less than a quarter of the amount they were before 1603. But then after these plots, like the Main and the Bye plots, and the adverse reaction he got from England, from like Puritans and even his Anglicans who didn't want James to be lenient towards Catholics, he wanted them to be punished harshly for not attending church. So recusancy fines were ultimately ordered to be higher. I think they were at some points ordered to be collected in full. And also all Jesuits were ordered out of the kingdom. And then in 1604, Parliament passed an act for the due execution of the statutes against any manner of recusants, which is a mouthful, but it just enforced the ideas that Catholics weren't tolerated in England and would have to pay recusancy fines in full. And so this is significant to James, I think, because he obviously agreed to this. I think he didn't want to antagonise Parliament, especially not so early in his reign. So he would pretty much agree to anything relating to this because it wasn't on his priorities, I guess. So, and he also wanted concessions at this point from Parliament over terms of the Union because he wanted Scotland and England to become Great Britain. I think he was focusing mostly on his relations with Parliament. It was top priority, so he would allow him. So next we can look at the Gunpowder Plot in 1605. I'm not going to go through it because I can't be bothered if you want to know. I mean, I'm sure you know enough, but Google it, I don't know. But we can look at the impacts of the Gunpowder Plot. So Parliament were ultimately overjoyed at the fact that the king was saved and wasn't blown up, I guess. So they firstly passed really harsh measures against Catholics, and they also gave him a large grant, which I'll go through in the video on James's finances. So there was more oppressive penal laws passed after Gunpowder Plot, so things like Catholics couldn't vote, they through a customs, I think specifically, had to have 2/3 of their property confiscated, or they couldn't live in London, etc, etc, couldn't hold public office. And then in 1605 there was the Oath of Allegiance, which is where Catholics in England had to swear that the king was the true ruler and the true protector of the faith, and it was made high treason to obey the authority of the Pope over the king and the authority of Rome. I think James hoped that this would identify those who were more radical Catholics and weren't willing to conform in England, and so these were the ones who would get punished in consequence. I think if we look at the overall treatment of Catholics at the reign, because this is only 1605 upwards, I think after this, the Catholic influence, I mean, openly diminished. There was no more Catholic plots against James. And I think once the memory of the plot began to fade, James was more lenient towards Catholics. He returned to his former leniency of the recusancy fines, and they weren't ordered in full as much. They weren't as vigorously enforced, stuff like that. I think ultimately the attitude in England and James's attitude to Catholics depended on things external to England. So things like foreign policy were quite significant in changing attitudes to Catholics. So when we get to Spanish Match and stuff like that, James is a lot more lenient to Catholics because he wants the support of Spain for the Spanish Match. But then after that fails, you get people like James and Buckingham who are a lot more hostile towards Catholics. So it really just depends about the political climate, I think, of foreign policy and outside of England at the time. But I think it was a consensus in most of England that Catholics were evil and were plotters. So I mean, the attitude is still very strong against Catholics, so like popish conspiracy, popish plot, stuff like that. It's a different day, so that's why we look different. But anyway, so now if we look at Arminians and the role of Arminianism in the latter half of James's period, and it become a lot more important in Charles's reign, but we'll go through that in a later video. So it's a branch domination of Christianity again. I don't think we need to go through the ins and outs, but it's different to Calvinism in where it rejects ideas of double predestination, it believes more in free will and stuff like that. But if you look at it in like practices and how it's perceived, it's aligned more, it's not Catholic, but it's aligned more with Catholicism. It's more like high Anglican. So it wasn't necessarily liked in England that much. But yeah, James was at first hostile, but then quite quickly became more openly accepting and more openly supportive of Arminians, and began promoting them. So people like Lancelot Andrewes and Richard Neil Nell, he promoted them to better bishop positions, that's hard to say, in England. And I think James supported Arminians mostly because they believed in divine right and kind of like the rules of kingship, and that the king is the kind of holy position on earth and in the country, and they're the ones who you should follow above anybody else. So obviously this suited James and suited what he wanted to do, especially like with the Spanish Match and stuff like that. It meant Arminians supported the Spanish Match and promoted that because that was what James wanted, that was what the king wanted, so they would support this. But then people like the Puritans and just the Anglicans wouldn't be happy with the Spanish Match because Catholics, but then Arminians would still support it anyway. And I think James also supported Arminianism because he wanted a balance in his church. Like he wanted like via media with the middle way. He didn't want to be too like leaning towards kind of like Puritans and things, especially since they were getting a lot more influence. He wanted to represent the middle of low and high Anglican. So he's got the Puritans in his church and an influence who were the low Anglican. I think he wanted to bring in the high Anglicans as well, so the Arminians, to just make his church more balanced. A key figure who pops up at this point is William Laud, who is an Arminian, and at this point doesn't have much power, but he has secured the royal patronage, so like the influence and support of Buckingham. He was obviously the most powerful person in England at this time, minus James. And I think James was very worried about the growing influence of Laud, because I think he suspected that he would try and gain more power and try and spread Arminianism like too far. And so James tried to prevent any big promotions for William Laud, so he gave him like a really small promotion in like Wales or something like that to satisfy both Charles and Buckingham, who really wanted Laud to get these promotions because I think both Buckingham and Charles were not necessarily Arminians, but they definitely liked the more high Anglican aspects of the church, like they liked kind of like sacraments, you know, like the colourful stuff. So James did promote Laud, but he was apprehensive of it, which I think is just quite telling that James was quite a smart cookie and he knew what was coming with William Laud, which we will see when we go through Charles's reign. I think if we look at religious reforms in the 1620s, we can really see the impact of Arminianism and how it kind of created a more fragmented religious scene in England at the time. It was becoming a lot more divided and a lot more problematic, which we see again a lot more in Charles's reign. So for example, in 1622, James passes the Declaration of Preachers, which stops churches discussing any kind of government policy or any kind of like state political issues at the time, to kind of prevent any opposition and prevent kind of like any rebellions or any sort of, not rebellions as such, but any sort of tensions brewing up, because there was already a lot of conflict at this time. And in 1622 also, James ordered that only people with a Bachelor of Divinity, I think this was kind of like qualification of being a preacher, so anybody with that qualification or higher were the only ones who were allowed to preach about any kind of big religious ideas, so things like predestination, which again shows the growing conflict in religion at this time, which is only just going to continue and is going to be very influential in Charles's reign. And also look at the fragmentation of religion as not just being due to the introduction of Arminianism, but also to do with the political context of the time and the issues of foreign policy, because Puritans wanted James and Anglicans to follow a very like pro-Protestant foreign policy, so supporting countries like that and being very anti-Spanish especially. But then with things like the Spanish March, James's foreign policy really went away from the ideals of the Puritans and Anglicans at that time, and so that caused a lot of conflict. But yeah, I still think he was quite careful to maintain a balance in his clergy and just in his church in general. So like he was still appointing more Calvinist bishops at the time. He was promoting these Arminian bishops. So I think that really shows us why the religious conflict wasn't as severe as it could have been, because of James's attempt to keep that consensus. But then we are creating the political climate which will be tested in Charles's reign, because unlike James, he doesn't have the same skill or the same want to maintain the balance, which is keeping religion stable in England during James's reign, but won't in Charles's. Just to finish, we'll have a quick look at religion in Scotland and Ireland at this time, although I don't think it's that important in James's reign. It becomes a lot more important in Charles's. So if we look at Scotland, James wanted to try and bring the Scottish Church, or the Kirk, in more conformity with England, but he didn't press it too hard. So, for example, he did succeed in bringing some nobles away from the Kirk and becoming more influenced by the English settlement, the Anglican Church, and they did try and make some changes. So, for example, James in 1618 with the Articles of Perth, which were religious reforms. However, they were deeply unpopular with the Kirk because they were quite intense, I think, quite quickly. So things like they imposed a religious interpretation that was more aligned with, in the Scottish Presbyterian, very kind of Puritanish. They saw this as too Catholic, definitely too aligned with the Catholic Church, such as I think the Articles of Perth included things like kneeling for communion and stuff like that, which were too kind of sacramental, so aligned away from Presbyterianism and more Catholic. And so due to this poor reaction, we can see how James didn't enforce the Articles of Perth after their introduction. And he also didn't introduce a new prayer book that had been written ready to introduce. He kind of scrapped the idea and said, no, we're not going to introduce it, because he saw the reaction with the Articles of Perth. And I'm explaining this like this because we can see the comparisons and the parallels from Charles's reign, from when like Charles had a political climate in Scotland that was very similar to James's, and where James backed away and realised that this would cause too much conflict to try and influence their church. Charles didn't necessarily recognise that and enforced change anyway, which is what we can see being a key event in the lead up to the Civil War. We can also have a look at Ireland at this time. So I think the big thing about Ireland is the plantations. So specifically with Scotland, a lot of Scottish people went to Ireland to settle there and spread more of a Protestant Presbyterian influence. So such as in 1607 was the start of the plantation of Ulster. So where Scottish people, Presbyterians, and I think some Anglicans as well in England, went to settle Ulster, so like in the north of Ireland. And I think that starts the religious conflict in Ireland, which we see come to a climax in Charles's reign. And so because we have lots of different divisions in Ireland, because we have like the Old Irish, the Native Irish, and the New English Irish, who are still mostly Catholic, but now we're getting these Presbyterians and these Protestants, which are going to cause massive clashes later. I think James recognised the instability of this, because James purposely didn't make any religious reforms in Ireland. He never tried to align like the Church of Ireland with England and the Church of England, because he realised it was too fragile and would cause too much conflict, which Charles didn't realise, or did, but didn't care. So thank you for watching. Subscribe for more content.